Once upon a time, there was a cube. This cube was pretty shapeless, except for the fact that it was shaped like a cube. And I thought it would be a fun creative challenge to try to take this cube and to form it into something other than a cube, only by removing blocks, not adding any. So we are going to attempt sculpting inside of Minecraft, using just this cube and a few commands that I'm about to show you, because it is rather large and doing it by hand would be way too tedious. These are the commands I ended up using mostly in this challenge, so if you wanted to try it yourself, this is what I used. I used, first of all, a basic sphere brush, which would just place air. And just to be safe for extra measure, I did go ahead and make it masking my main block, which is wool. That's optional, it's not really necessary. And then of course I could adjust the size of it as needed. The next one is probably the most useful one I found out, is the select convex, which I did use the cuboid selection tube, although the convex one was super useful for getting straight edges that were on different angles. So you can use this to create all kinds of weird polygons and then just set it to 0 and voila, you have carved a shape out of your cube. And another one is the Voxelsniper line brush. So you have your arrow and gunpowder, you just use the command B line, make sure the voxel is set to air, and you're good to go. You can click around, make straight lines, and you can even keep clicking to keep placing lines on top of each other. This is also a useful carving tool I have found out. Another one that I didn't use as often, but I thought I'd show it to you because I did use it once or twice, is I did use loft if you need to create a nice smooth curved shape. This one is a little bit harder to use for carving because it's generally thinner, it doesn't have much thickness to it, but if you can use it effectively, it does make mapping out curved areas much easier. Just to make this challenge easier myself, I did allow a couple things that some might consider cheating, but I did allow the blend ball brush first of all for Voxelsniper. Now this doesn't perfectly only remove blocks, sometimes it does fill in blocks, but I allowed it because it makes smoothing so much easier. Just imagine it's like sandpaper. We'll just pretend it's like the sandpaper of my sculpture and I'm just sandpapering. We'll just say that. It works. And then of course I allowed myself to undo things. So if I didn't have this sculpture would have ended up probably a lot worse than it actually did. So those are the commands I used and a couple exceptions I allowed myself, given that this challenge is done in Minecraft. Now that I've clarified all of the rules to my challenge, let's go see how I actually did. Okay, I'm gonna start off by saying my first mistake was that I made this cube way bigger than it needed to be, or at least maybe I just overestimated how much cube I would actually need to sculpt. Or maybe it's just that I didn't feel like carving a super large sculpture, so you'll find that I ended up actually cutting away most of this cube, but that's okay because I think starting out at a larger size did help me so that I could just keep gradually shrinking it if I needed to, because I can always take away blocks, I just can't add any. As you can see, I'm approaching this sculpture by starting off with the things closest to the viewer, so whatever objects or forms are closest to me, I had to make sure to get those first, and then I gradually worked my way back and gradually made it more and more three-dimensional. Now this was my second attempt at making this sculpture. My first attempt, I made the mistake of trying to sculpt it from the top down, and that didn't work out so well because I can't really visualize how it's supposed to look from the top. So this really helped me because it's almost like I'm just drawing the picture straight in front of me, but just having to think about, okay, what is closest to me and what do I need to do first? There were a couple times where I almost didn't leave room for something, like, oh, I'm supposed to have an arm there, I should probably make room for that. So it's definitely a different way of thinking when it comes to making artwork, one that I'm not used to. So it definitely was a challenge for me to try to remember all the different parts and not carve away too much. I know that I did have the option to undo, but sometimes I would get so far into it that I wouldn't want to undo it because then I would undo all this work I had just put in. So even though I did have that option available to me, it still didn't make it much easier because sometimes I would get so far along, I just didn't want to undo all that work I put into it. Also, every time I logged off the server and came back, then I couldn't undo anything from the previous session. So basically, the few times I would log off and come back, it basically locked it where it was, so I didn't always have that option available to me. And as you can see, most of my cube I actually ended up using for a cool geometric background. But I think it's a good thing I didn't make the sculpture larger, because as it is, it took me a little over 10 hours. I did add some details here and there, and I probably could have added more, but there's rarely any time where I'm 100% satisfied with the build before I just stop working on it. So here's a sculpture, we're going to call it done, but now I kind of want to go back and just evaluate it a little bit and see what I could have done differently. Obviously, I know the number one thing I think could have been improved is my proportions. They're not exactly very good. Like the chest area especially is super flat, and actually maybe it's a little bit too big. I probably could have tweaked it. The neck is a little bit too far to the left when you're looking at it straight on. The arms are an awkward length. The shoulders are not spaced correctly. Like this shoulder is way too far out. This shoulder is probably better, but there was just like a lot of little things like that. I don't even know if the arms are the same length, but for what it is, I think it's pretty good considering it's my second attempt at doing something like this. And the cello, oh, that was so hard. I tried to get some string detail in there and trying to get the edges rounded correctly and trying to get the shape right, but I don't think I quite mastered this. It's still recognizable as a cello, so I guess that's all that really matters. Anyway, something that I was going to add that I actually didn't, I was thinking about adding like a stool or a chair that she was sitting on, but the more I did it, the more I'm like, well, I don't really want to go into the details of adding that, especially when she's got this long flowing dress. I wasn't sure how the dress would flow around that, so I was like, I'll just leave it as it is. We'll just say she's sitting on this giant rock thing. And the other thing that I really wasn't happy with, but I ended up just giving up on, was her hair. Right now, it's kind of in these big blobs, and I did have it curve a little bit in the back, as you can see. The loft tool really helped me get that nice curve shape, but as far as like the detail in the hair, I was thinking about going through it and adding more detail, but I was kind of too scared to. I didn't want to mess it up too much, so I decided to just leave it because I think it looks fine. And I do kind of like the simplistic shapes that are happening everywhere, so I think it worked out okay. So there you have it, my attempt at sculpting, starting from a cube and just taking away the blocks. Now, this was an exercise to practice shaping, so I didn't really go into great detail in coloring it, but in case you're curious, here's how it might look colored. I didn't add tons of textures, this was just for fun, but I thought it still looked kind of cool, so I thought I'd show it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and maybe you'll want to try a challenge like this, maybe one not so big as mine, because it did take a long time, but it's really up to you. It is a fun challenge, and it does really exercise your mind. At least for me, it was difficult to think about the placement of the forms, and which ones are closer to you, which ones are farther away. But anyway, I think I have talked enough about this sculpture. Let me see. I'm going to rate it 7 out of 10. I think it could have been better, but for my first attempt, it's not too bad. That being said, I hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and I hope to see you again in another video sometime, somewhere, somehow. Goodbye, everyone.